It's a tragedy what's happened.
Can you tell us about the meal that you cooked?
I'm so devastated by what's happened, by the loss of Don. Don is still in hospital, the loss of Ian and Heather and Gail. They were some of the best people that I've ever met.
Can you tell us where the mushrooms came from?
This case is one that has literally transfixed a nation, and also myself. But from the beginning of this case, I'm going to be honest, I was really on the fence. I genuinely wondered whether there was sufficient evidence to actually convict Erin Patterson, who's kind of widely known as the mushroom murderer these days. Genuinely worried that there was some kind of circumstantial case here. But as I've gone into it, well, I'm not necessarily on the fence anymore. Let's go back to the 29th of July 2023. This is when Erin Patterson does what we all do. She invites over her 4 elderly relatives for lunch at her home, and she's going to serve them this delicious homemade beef Wellington. The only thing is that a week later, 3 of them are dead, and another one of them lies in intensive care, and every single one of them seems to have had this baffling illness. Doctors are searching for answers everywhere. They've no idea what's happened and what's at play here. And from literally outset, this case gripped the nation. The question was, were these deaths this tragic accident or something really far more sinister? Now, Erin, she denied any wrongdoing and still does. But the problem is her stories raise questions. And those questions were the fact that all the guests had been connected to a past family dispute. And I guess that what makes this case really disturbing and compelling in equal measure, it's the intersection of domestic familiarity and fatal betrayal. And that makes us ask a really challenging question, doesn't it? Is it possible that the greatest dangers in our lives aren't strangers, but the ones who know us best? The ones who can sit with us at a dinner table talking about what's been going on in their lives without even taking a breath when something diabolical happens to us at their hands. I mean, it's genuinely a really big question. I think a lot of us ask that question around people that we genuinely care for. And that is, do we ever really know them? And can we ever truly trust them? So today we are covering the incredibly complex story of Erin Patterson, who's known as the Death Cap murderer. And let me tell you, it takes some twists and turns. Even if you've seen somebody else covering this case, stay with me. I promise that you will learn more by the end of this story. Let's talk about Erin Trudy Patterson. Her maiden name was Scudder. She had a relatively privileged life. So she was born on the 30th of September 1974. She was born in Glen Waverley, which is a basic suburb in Melbourne, Australia, nice area. She was raised in an academic family, an intellectual family. So her mother, Heather Scudder, she was a really well-respected lecturer at Monash University. She was an expert in children's literature, and she was somebody who wrote academic articles. She'd also written a book called Displaced Fictions, and it analyses contemporary Australian books for teenagers and young adults. So a very bright button, I believe we can say. And the people who remember Heather, Erin's mother, the colleagues that she worked with, for example, said she was just a really lovely co-worker. She was absolutely dedicated to her job, but she wasn't the most sociable individual. And I do believe that on a temperament level, Erin follows some of those traits. Now, Patterson's father, Ethan Scudder, he was very successful. He'd had director roles in multiple Australian companies. This included in his home state of South Australia and at Eden in New South Wales, where he then went on to retire. So super successful parents. And I think the psychology that is involved when it comes down to parents who are super successful is, as a child, you're always a little bit worried that you'll live in their shadows. I do appreciate that there'll be people out there and people listening to this who are in a monetary position that I would envy. And your children won't have to worry about money and careers because you'll be in a situation where financially you've made the money and they can just enjoy their lives. And if you want to adopt me, I am available. I don't have parents anymore. I would like a new set of parents. And if you happen to have a trust fund that you wish to bequeath on me, I will accept that with grace and humility. But essentially, for the most people coming to this channel, and certainly myself included, It can be challenging when your parents are really successful, because you want to do them proud. Often you want to imagine a life that's even better than the life they've created. And it gives you a burden that they haven't given you personally, but that you will often carry. Now, not everybody will follow that protocol of psychology, but what I'm saying is it's very, very common. So for Erin Patterson, she may grow up feeling that she should have a life that is similar to her parents. And if she's willing to work for that effectively, that means that she's somebody who expects that without a level of entitlement. But also, she may have a burden psychologically of wishing to achieve what they have and not necessarily always have the means to create that. And then on top of that, there is the final one, which is that she may have a level of entitlement, which means that she doesn't really want to work, she just wants to have. So it's a multifaceted, multi-layered arena where our parents' success is concerned. But certainly, she's brought up in a loving, connected family who do well. Now, by Patterson's own personal account, she said that she did struggle with self-esteem. She also struggled with eating disorders from a young age. And I just want to point out here that when you see photographs and video of Erin Patterson, she's very large. So she's an individual who carries a large amount of weight around her. And a lot of people will say, well, that's not an eating disorder. That's just somebody who's greedy, for example. And I cannot impart to you how incorrect that perspective is, even though I completely understand where that is driven from. Eating disorders are complex, multifaceted, multi-layered. You can be anorexic, as I was when I was a younger person, and went through binge eating behaviours and a lot of other things, including a year of just compulsive eating, where I put on weight and just decided that that would be a way that I'd handle it, just to give in and accept it, so to speak. And then over a few years, I healed and I don't have any issues around food whatsoever now. But the point is, I understand the multi-layered experience of being someone who struggles with weight. And also I did my master's on eating disorders because I feel that the treatment's really inaccurate and inadequate in the UK. So when it comes down to people who are very overweight, often they have the same issues as the person who is underweight, which is that they see themselves through a lens where they don't feel good enough. Now, the anorexic may wear their body as a sign of sickness because they look so sick and ill, and it screams to people, I'm unwell. And often that's because they need somebody to notice their pain because they don't know how to handle it themselves. And you get people who are very, very large who also, when they're uncomfortable with their largeness, not everybody is, but when they are, they also wear that largeness like a sounding of distress. It's saying to people, I'm struggling. And like I said, not all people who are large feel that way, but certainly there is a proportion of individuals who do. And it means that you're trying to get help, but you don't quite know how to achieve it. And often people don't want to talk about weight because there is a whole scenario around whether it's acceptable to raise questions with people that you love, particularly if they are individuals who are very, very thin or very, very big. So I have no doubt whatsoever that she's telling me the truth about the fact that she struggled with her self-esteem, that she probably comfort eats and fixes those challenging emotions like loneliness through food and doesn't quite know how to achieve change because it's really complex and it's really difficult to understand. She actually also said that she went through some challenging experiences as a kid. So she said, when I was a kid, Mum would weigh us every week to make sure we weren't putting on too much weight. Now that is terrible, but I have to say, I come from a parenting class who were all very similar. My own mother would be horrified to imagine that we'd put weight on as a child because she felt the world would be unfair to us. So we, my sister and I, unlike my brother, were treated very differently where food was concerned. And did that have an interplay into the issues I developed? Certainly. Was my mother to blame? Absolutely not. We make our choices. But the reality is that it's very challenging when you have a parent who's making you get weighed, and if you fail, it's because you put on a pound, and if you succeed, it's because you lost a pound. And actually, it really plays with our understanding of what makes us acceptable in life. And Erin said that, after this point in time, she barely ate food as a kid, and then she started to develop lifelong issues with food, and some of that would be overeating. Now, despite the fact that she's got these personal challenges, which have been very difficult as a young person, She does really well in education. She stands out. She's super smart. She's very capable at school. And in 1992, she earns a place in a science course at the University of Melbourne. And she eventually does leave the course. She switches to accounting instead. And I would say that's one of the things I've really noted about Erin Patterson. It feels like there is a transience in the places that she works. And I think that we can all agree that that can be because sometimes we find a job that is just an ill fit for us, and we can do that on several occasions. It can also mean there is something about our personality that doesn't connect with the people that we work with. Or it can be that our actions at work make us unsuitable, shall we say, for remaining at that place of employment. But it always begs a few questions when somebody leaves things relatively quickly. I always ask myself the question when I look at CVs of people in the past on used to employ people, if they've got a lot of different jobs over a short amount of space and time, it worries me, because I want to see some kind of commitment and determination, but also a sense that this person knows how to fit in. Because when you're employing people, it is a really difficult balance to strike. You want people to connect with the other workers, you want them to be a good employee who does their job well, and you don't want them to cause issues, because it really does make for a poor work-life experience when that occurs. So that's just one of those red flags, and it really does seem to stand out where Erin Patterson is concerned. Now, in 2001, Patterson actually trains to become an air traffic controller. Now, this is one of the most notoriously difficult entrance exams to get through, and she does that very, very well. So she joins an Air Services Australia trainee class in Melbourne. It doesn't last very long. So she's an air traffic controller, which is a very well thought of career. It's a dangerous career to some degree. And on top of that, it's a very responsible career, and it carries a good wage packet. So essentially, this would be something that most people would celebrate, but she doesn't necessarily know how to commit, as I'm saying, to the jobs that she engages in, even when they are very, very sought after. So people who knew her said, yeah, it was a short-lived career that she had, but it was pretty memorable to the people who actually worked with her. So former colleagues, they said one of the things that stood out was that she was highly intelligent. There's a quote actually saying she was clever, she is no dope. But they said that Erin Patterson was socially withdrawn. Sometimes she's quite abrasive. And in spite of the fact that she had this deep intellect that was very clear to those who worked with her, there was a lack in her social skills. So she wasn't very good at building relationships with people. Now, bear in mind, there was a very tight-knit cohort of 14 trainees at that time, and she was just considered a loner, which again, everybody has an option to choose what they do with their time. You don't have to hang out with your colleagues. I get it. I never went to one Christmas do with literally my own employer because I worked enough. I didn't want the extra hours. I really like the people I work with, but when it came down to my social life, I'd just rather sit in and look at a wall for a few hours. That's more relaxing, thank you very much. But if there's 14 trainees and you're going through a pretty rigorous experience, you would imagine that camaraderie and connection is really important. And she just doesn't seem to want to get involved. She declines social invitations. She very much keeps herself to herself. In fact, she ends up earning the name Scudder the Nutter, which isn't nice at all. I mean, you'd be sacked for that these days, wouldn't you? If there was a group of cohorts who were all bullying somebody, calling them Scudder the Nutter, even if some of the actions and behaviours of the individual that they're applying that term to did, shall we say, fit the typologies that they're trying to put across, it's not acceptable. And also it's very alienating. So they can say, well, she didn't want to get involved, but equally it sounds like there was a lot of bitchiness in that situation. And it turns out that she didn't just distance herself from the other air traffic controllers, but they kind of felt that she did things that made it impossible to warm to her, or even, shall we say, go as far as to dislike her. So some of the co-workers described her as a little bit strange. They said that she'd have these really sudden mood swings. And that's really challenging at work because we want to feel that there's a sense of balance. We certainly don't want to feel like we're treading on eggshells, and she seemed to have that impact on people. And one person said, you tended to be wary that she could snap or say something unpleasant at the drop of a hat. So clearly Erin Patterson isn't effective with boundaries and probably doesn't understand the nuance of certain communication styles. Another worker said she could be quite aggressive in the way that she spoke to people and said she just wasn't someone you connected to. Apparently she'd make weird comments. She often looked unkempt shifts, and she's apparently very secretive about her personal life outside of work. Now, when somebody looks unkempt, often that comes down to self-esteem issues. Often there are issues in mental health, and certainly Erin Patterson, from what she's talked about historically, does seem to suffer from certain mental health conditions during her life. And an eating disorder is one of those. And when you've got an eating disorder, your self-esteem is just on the floor. It's as simple as that. You're not really bothered about the way you look. You hate yourself so much. So it is in keeping with the narrative that she's talked about from her earlier years. Now, there was even at work a very odd incident that stuck with people. This is where Patterson basically reportedly impersonated a sick colleague over the phone. And the reason that she did that was she wanted to pick up extra shifts. Now, that was a prank that kind of surprised a lot of the team members because, first of all, the ill co-worker comes to work as normal. A little bit on the awkward side when somebody's impersonating that person saying they're not going to be able to come in. But the belief behind Patterson doing that is that she wanted the shifts that were more preferable. So she looks like she's covering somebody's sick leave, but really she's just getting the shifts that she likes. Then on another relatively disturbing occasion, a colleague had actually accused Patterson of having hidden a blade in a banana that she'd essentially removed from a pencil sharpener. Now that is really scary because that would cause such unbelievable damage to somebody's insides. And you can imagine just how simple that's to do. If you get a blade out of a sharpener and you put it into a banana, and that banana, the person isn't really taking that much care when they're peeling it, they're not noticing the skin has actually been, cut in any way, you could cause deep internal injuries, if not even worse. And that's if an adult gets hold of it. God forbid the adult takes it home, they've got a kid at home, and the child swallows it. And these are all the kind of things that can happen when people mess with food in that way. That's why it's considered such a dangerous thing to do and receives really strong penalties in most countries when people mess with foods. So people felt that she had some kind of potential for malevolence, and a lot of people who knew her just described her as a pathological liar. They said that her intelligence led to her being highly manipulative and that she had this constant aura about her that was really off-putting. So let's just frame that in a very simple way. She was not a popular workmate. She was not somebody that people wished to be around. She was not the kind of person that you felt necessarily was even safe to be around, let alone somebody you want to strike up some kind of friendship with. Now we get to November 2002. Patterson ends up leaving the air traffic control field after less than 2 years. So like I said, that's a short amount of time to be in a job, and she doesn't leave of her own volition, she's fired. And the reason that she's fired is because Erin Patterson likes to just leave work early quite frequently, which, let's just throw it in there, it's air traffic control. The last thing that you need when you are landing planes and letting planes take off is just a staff member who's like, well, I could complete my shift, could make sure that people are safe, or I could just bob home and not worry about it and just hope that nobody crashes. So that's clearly going to be gross misconduct, and she's treated accordingly for that by losing her position. Now, of course, when she is questioned on the fact that she's been leaving early, she's like, absolutely not true. I've not been doing that at all. That's lies. I've just been doing my shifts without a problem. I don't know what you're talking about. And they're like, well, that is nice to hear because we would like you to be a diligent little worker. But unfortunately, we have surveillance logs from a car park that show that you are. So even when she's confronted with a situation that she knows damn well she's been doing something wrong around, she doesn't acknowledge it. She doesn't accept blame. She doesn't take responsibility. She does quite the contrary. She tries to talk her way out of it, and then it's embarrassing because they've actually got her on CCTV showing that she leaves work early. Now, by 2004, she ends up switching career paths completely. She starts working in animal management for the RSPCA at a municipal council building in Melbourne's southeast. And it's here that I suppose a sliding doors moment occurs and she meets who will be her future husband. So she meets Simon Patterson. He is working as an engineer at Monash City Council. And I suppose they met in the old-fashioned way, because these days it's all about swiping right, isn't it? You're on Tinder, you're on Hinge. But back in the day, people of my age, for example, we actually met people at work, sometimes in social situations where we left the house. But essentially, they start hanging out in a friend group. So they're often meeting for lunch, they're often getting together for after work drinks, and Simon and Erin Patterson begin dating. They're going on camping trips with friends, and Simon Patterson is really quite charmed by the fact that she's really witty and she's obviously deeply intellectual. She's a very intelligent woman, and he finds that something that he admires. And he later said, I guess some of the things that attracted me to her in the first place was definitely her intelligence. She's quite witty, she can be quite funny. So that's what connects them. Now, in June 2004, Patterson has a really serious run-in with the police, and this kind of invites us into her psyche to some degree. So she gets involved in a drunk driving crash in Glen Waverley. She's nearly 3 times over the legal blood alcohol limit. She's also driving an unregistered car. I mean, when it comes down to, let's just get myself into an enormous amount of trouble, well, driving an unregistered car and being 3 times over the legal limit is going to do that. And it demonstrates the fact that she's got poor impulse control. Most of us, even when we're drunk, would never even consider getting into a car, let alone driving without a registration or without insurance. In fact, even when sober, most of us wouldn't do that. We just know the morality and ethics that are impacted when you make those decisions. But she goes ahead and does that. Also, after she has the crash, got to give it to her, she took an unusual route for a woman. She just ran off without giving a name. She was just like, I am going to head for the hills again. Really poor impulse control, really poor consequential thinking, because they're obviously going to come after you. And obviously she does get caught. She ends up pleading guilty to 5 charges related to the incident. She's fined and she was banned from driving for 2.5 years. Now, despite this incident, Patterson's relationship with Simon does grow more intense. I guess that he just does the classic belief in her just making an awful mistake and gives her the goodwill that she's a decent human being in his experience, and it was just something that they can move forward with. But really, if somebody that you are in a relationship with does that, you have to question the other boundaries that they'll be willing to breach as well, because it's a pretty serious indication of their willingness to act inappropriately when there is an appropriate expectation for rules and regulations to be followed. She obviously doesn't play that game. She does what she wants. Then in 2007, they end up getting married. That's 3 years after they've met. And Erin Patterson's parents didn't actually attend the wedding. Apparently they were in Russia on a train. I don't know about you, but you do have quite a lot of time to organise the wedding. I'm sure that Erin Patterson's parents knew that she was getting married. And I'm just going to say they should have had the good grace to actually turn up. Or was it that they just didn't have a close relationship with their daughter? Was it that there were breaches in the foundations of that relationship that had become so problematic that the idea of actually watching her walk down the aisle wasn't really something that they were into because they had grievances with her? Was it just an excuse that they were in Russia on a train? Did they even know about the wedding? These are all questions that you have to ask when somebody is known to be a bit of a pathological liar. And it turns out that Simon's cousin walks Patterson down the aisle. And from that point on, Erin Patterson does build a really close relationship with Simon's family. This includes his parents, Don and Gail. Now, it won't be long after they get married that their lives change really quite dramatically. And the reason for this is Erin Patterson receives a substantial inheritance. So in 2006, her grandmother, Ora Scudder, she dies, and she leaves a really significant estate. So Patterson's portion of that estate ultimately amounts to around 2 million Australian dollars. Now, it's paid out over several years. It begins being paid out in 2007, but let's be real. That is a large sum of money that everybody would like the windfall of. So they end up, as a couple, quitting their jobs. They decide they're going to travel around Australia, and I guess they're checking out places that they might wish to live because they're traveling around, but they eventually settle in Western Australia. They bought homes without mortgages in both Perth, York and Pemberton. So on a real estate level, they are flying and they're really nice areas. And Patterson actually ends up opening a secondhand bookshop in Pemberton, and Simon, he's working for the local council. So they are doing really, really well. You know, for newlyweds, they're in a situation that 99.999% of us just dream of. And whilst they're living there, they do what so many young married couples do. They have the first child, and that's a little boy. And Patterson at this point said that this is when her relationship with Don and Gail, Simon's parents, become really close because she has her first child and she just felt really isolated as a new mother. She said Don and Gail flew out to support her, and there's a quote where she notes, "I remember being really relieved that Gail was there because I felt really out of my depth. I had no idea what to do with the baby. She was really supportive and gentle and patient with me." And then Don, well, he's a retired school teacher. He's got apparently a very gentle, kind, compassionate nature. And the thing about he and Patterson is they're quite academic. So they apparently bonded over a, quote, love of knowledge and learning. So in the end, Simon and Patterson moved to be closer to their in-laws. So they relocate to Corumburra, which is in Victoria. And this is so that the parents can help out. This is where they have their second child, who's a little girl. And when she's born, apparently it was the doting grandparents who brought Patterson and Simon's son to meet his new sister. And they just remain very close at this point. The Patterson family apparently a very devout Baptist family, and they very much welcomed Patterson into their church community as well. Also, there's Don and Gail's brother-in-law, Ian Wilkinson. He was actually a local pastor at Corumburra Baptist Church, and his wife, Heather Wilkinson, Gail's sister, was also part of this close family network. So they all socialise at church events, and Patterson would sometimes host meals at the family home. There's a connection, there's a closeness, and even though I would say that Erin Patterson wasn't some kind of devout Baptist, she enjoys the connections that she has, and the church is central to their life, even though she might not be somebody who has a great belief system. But what we're seeing at this point is this genuinely connected cohort of people with quite strong belief systems, certainly for Simon's family, who genuinely wish to help out Patterson, particularly with two young children. And it seems to be something that Patterson really respects and is grateful for. Now, to those who knew Patterson, she appears to be an absolutely devoted mother of two. And I will say, I genuinely do think she's a relatively devoted mother, full stop. So as much as I'm going to talk about this case and be very critical about certain actions, the reality is that when it comes down to the relationship we had with the children, I do think that was a genuinely close relationship. I think there was a lot of love there, and is a lot of love there. So she's bringing up these two small children. She's also an involved member of the Corumburra Leongatha community, and she's getting involved as a volunteer. She edits a local newsletter, she volunteers at community events, she participates in online discussions about particular true crime cases, by the way. One of the things that she's really into is being kind of a home sleuth. So she's online on forums just chatting about cases. She also gets involved online with lots of local issues. In fact, friends knew her, quote, as an internet super sleuth who avidly followed true crime Facebook groups. So she's into the arena that all of us are also into. But one can say, well, some people are into it because you genuinely see legacy for justice of victims. And others can say, well, there'll be a small minority of individuals who go on these particular forums because they want to take tips. And like it or otherwise, when we cover a lot of murders, that's exactly what people have been doing. They've been online researching crimes and trying to hone their skills when it comes to getting away with murder. Now, in 2019, Patterson has another windfall. Very sadly, her father dies in 2011 from pancreatic cancer. So obviously his estate transfers over to her mother. But then in 2019, her mother also dies. So at this point, she and her sister, they inherit the parents' estate. This includes a $900,000 beachfront retirement home in Eden, New South Wales. And I can imagine they also had savings. So that's a lot of money again coming into her hands. This then allows Patterson and Simon to provide no interest loans to several of Simon's siblings to help them buy homes, and actually total hundreds of thousands of dollars. Now, I am going to just note that suggests Patterson is not somebody who's a skinflint. She's not somebody who's greedy. She's not somebody who wants to hoard the wealth for herself, because it's Simon's relatives who are benefiting from those no interest loans. And some people will say that's really kind. Some people will say never a lender nor a borrower be, because often it can cause massive conflict in families when you hand out money and you don't get paid back. I'm not saying that this is in this case what happened. I'm saying that it's something that is very contextual, these kind of actions. And the fact that Erin Patterson is just handing that money out, it does suggest that there is a giving part of her nature. It's not what I would expect a sociopath or a psychopath to do, but nonetheless, she definitely does that, in spite of the fact that some people down the line will absolutely refer to her as a sociopath. Now, behind the closed doors, in spite of this giving to Simon's family and this apparent connection with the wider family, the marriage is actually under quite a lot of strain. In fact, that strain seems to have begun after the birth of their first child. And Simon and Erin Patterson go through multiple separations. They'll have brief breakups and they'll have reconciliations, but in the end they do decide to separate for good in 2015 and they reach a financial settlement that year. I would be really interested to know how that played out for Erin Patterson. I have tried to discover the figures. I'm going to imagine that he probably gets half of everything. And there's a little bit of me that thinks, well, that's kind of unfair. You know, if you get into a marriage and you inherit lots of money, and you then are gracious and generous enough to let your partner have all these wonderful experiences with you and buy property with you, it must be very galling and resentment inspiring if they get to walk away with half of what you actually brought into the relationship. And I know that some people think that that just should be the way it is. I personally, having gone through a divorce, feel it can create real resentment, and sometimes, unless you've earned it, don't get me wrong, where women are staying at home or men are staying at home and looking after the children, and another partner is afforded the opportunity to go to work and makes a lot of money, that person who stayed at home has given absolutely their 50% of that. I have no qualms in saying that. I'm just talking about where it's inheritance, where neither party's worked for it, but one party has been given it because it comes from their lineage, so to speak. Maybe they will have had that put into some kind of writing, but I just don't think that happened. And like I said, I think where resentment is concerned, when you lose a relationship, particularly one you might not wish to lose, and then you realise that you're losing half of all the money that was meant for you, it can be something that can provoke some pretty negative feelings, shall we say. But in spite of this, they do maintain a relatively good relationship. They're co-parents. They share the custody of the kids. They do a lot of family activities together. And Simon said that even as exes, they were chatty and they'd go on family holidays for the sake of the children more than anything else. But the fact is they could share space without having that many issues. That doesn't mean, of course, that beneath the surface, things aren't bubbling. We all know that people can wear a mask and make it seem that everything's okay. Very often, particularly if somebody still has an interest in the relationship being rekindled, they can continue to have lots of activities with their ex in the hope that one day they'll reconnect. That can also be a motivation, but often there's a festering frustration beneath the surface. So at this point, they're obviously in a solvent position. It means that they've got access to the world. They travel to New Zealand, South Australia, Adelaide, Botswana, South Africa, even to Darwin on family holidays. I love Darwin in the Northern Territory. I love it. I love it. I love Darwin in Australia. People said, why? Because everything kills you there. You know, don't get in the sea, saltwater crocodiles or the jellyfish or the, sharks will eat you. But at the end of the day, I just absolutely love that area. Sorry, I digress. But nonetheless, just to hear the word Darwin, I'm back there walking barefoot, going and watching the sunsets. Honestly, amazing place. By 2022, it turns out this amicable relationship, this co-parenting arrangement starts to really become stressful. It falters, shall we say. And one of the big motivations for this change psychologically towards one another and emotionally towards one another is that year, Simon files his tax return, and apparently due to a mix-up, he calls it a mix-up anyway. I'm not so sure it was. With respect, I cannot say whether Simon's telling the truth here or otherwise, but I just think it's very strange that this would be a mix-up, because apparently his accountant and he listed his status as single on the form. Now, he obviously is single in the fact that he and Erin have split up, but they had agreed to basically not state that because it would trigger Australia's Child Support Agency treating Patterson as a single mother. Now, that would mean that she was eligible for some support, but it also brings it into more of a legal context. And I think probably for Patterson, She feels like it's the end of the line for their relationship. And again, she probably hasn't wanted to accept that. Now, according to Simon, the agency at this point instruct him to stop directly paying for certain expenses he'd been covering, so children's school fees, medical bills, and instead let the formal child support system handle payments. And to Patterson, that felt like a betrayal. It felt like a financial attack. And again, I'm going to say I have some sympathy for Erin Patterson. He's had a whale of a time cashing in on her inheritance. Sorry, I'm going to say it as it is. So she's probably feeling like, you have had enough and now you're going to make it more difficult for me. That absolutely could be something that adds fuel to the fire of that frustration that's festering beneath the surface. So this means they lose their informal support arrangement, and it really upsets her. She feels like Simon is shrinking from his responsibilities, which would be appalling for somebody who's done very well financially from her. So at this point, she responds by lodging an official child support claim. And this is basically formalising their financial conflict. Now, this deeply strained not only Patterson's relationship with Simon, but also the relationship with his extended family too. And we all know how fractious it can be when families fall out. Also, we could add to this that where Erin Patterson is concerned, she finds that level of abandonment really challenging to manage. She's been very engaged and very involved with this family. She's got 2 children who belong to that family as blood relatives. And she's obviously put a lot of financial support into the Patterson family who were extended. And not feeling that she's got a level of respect within that situation might be very galling for her. And it turns out that around this point, Patterson, who would have been very engaged going to family events, for example, birthday parties, gatherings, they become more and more infrequent. And Simon's brother Matthew actually noted that Patterson skipped family events entirely. And if she did come, she didn't stay for very long. So we can assume she didn't feel welcome there. Patterson was actually very hurt when she believed she'd been a last-minute invite to Gail's 70th birthday party in 2023. And she just starts to sense that she's been edged out of the family. Now, like I note, that's probably also something that provokes fear because she's lent a lot of money to her husband's family members. And she might be thinking to herself, I'm going to walk away with serious financial implications here. She's potentially got some issues around abandonment or attachment within her own family because of the fact they didn't attend the wedding, even if it was her who chose them not to. She's probably got some issues around feeling quite isolated and alienated. And so now she's in a scenario where she's directing blame at these individuals, as opposed to understanding this is quite typical. When families break down, your blood relatives tend to be the ones that you will assume your relationship with. And the ex is often known as an ex for a reason, because they're kind of excommunicated from the entire family. Now, what we know is at this point, she starts venting her anger in group chats to friends. She's calling Simon's family a lost cause. She's saying, fuck them. Then in another message, Patterson's actually writing about Gail. She's saying, why isn't she horrified? Her son is such a deadbeat that I had no choice but to claim. So clearly dealing with some very challenging feelings that are manifesting more and more. And also, let's be real, when you've got an ex, who hasn't occasionally complained to a friend or a family member about the way that they are treating you? This is just very, very typical. So that's not indicative of her harbouring murderous intentions, but it certainly shows this escalation in feeling alienated and also feeling let down by people that she trusted. Now also, while there are these issues in the child payment situation, in the same year in May 2022, Simon gets really sick. Now, it turns out it's this kind of mysterious gastrointestinal illness, and it's so serious it nearly kills him. So he collapses at home. He ends up being in an induced coma for 16 days. He undergoes multiple emergency surgeries on his intestines. And actually, his family get invited to the hospital on 2 separate occasions to say goodbye. So he's genuinely, at this point, not expected to live. Now, ultimately, he spends 21 days in intensive care and then miraculously recovers. Now, at this point, the medical team believed that it was just some kind of medical mystery. There were no charges brought against anyone, but just to bring it in for your information, that there is this very strange scenario where Patterson's ex basically gets gravely unwell and then gets well. So Like I said, it's not as if charges are brought, but maybe there is a parallel there, or maybe it is indeed just coincidence. Now, in 2023, Patterson's looking at a new opportunity for training. She's accepted onto a course for nursing and midwifery, but she ends up deferring this for a year. So let's go now to the fatal lunch. 29th of July 2023, Patterson invites her family over to lunch at her home in Leongatha, which is a small country town of around 6,000 people. It's in South Gippsland in Victoria, in Australia. Now, this gathering is basically, shall we say, pitched as an opportunity to smooth over those family ties, because obviously there's been some fallouts, there's been some level of distance, and according to Patterson, she kind of wants to lay this to rest. She reaches out to them, so she speaks to Don and Gail, she speaks to Ian and Heather Wilkinson and says, look, come over, share a meal with me. Now, that's an unexpected invite. It had come a few Sundays before because they'd all been at church together, and after church they had that conversation. And Heather had actually penciled in errands for lunch into her diary for the 29th of July. Now, Patterson also extends the invitation to Simon, the man who she'd been married to, was now estranged from, but he said that he felt really uneasy. He declined, and actually he did that the night before. He said, quote, he was too uncomfortable, so he basically backed it out. And his text was sent at 6:45 p.m, which, with respect to any woman out there who's decided to go ahead and prepare a lovely feast for family members, that's a little bit short notice. Gonna be honest, it's not gonna go down well when you've kind of indicated that you would be going and then you pull out at the last minute. But this is what he wrote. Sorry, I feel too uncomfortable about coming to lunch with you, Mum and Dad, and Heather and Ian tomorrow, but I'm happy to talk about your health and the implications of that for another time if you'd like to discuss on the phone. Now, Patterson replies to that text just over about 10 minutes later, and she writes, that's really disappointing. I spent many hours this week preparing for lunch tomorrow, which has been exhausting in light of the issues I'm facing, and I spent a small fortune on beef fillet to make beef wellingtons because I wanted to make it a special meal, as I may not be able to host a lunch like this again for some time. It's important to me that you're all there tomorrow and that I have the conversations that I need to have. I hope you change your mind. Your parents and Heather and Ian are coming at 12:30. I hope to see you there. So that then leaves 4 guests scheduled to eat at Patterson's house. We've got Don Patterson, who's 70, Gail Patterson, who's 70, we've got Ian Wilkinson, who's 68, and Heather Wilkinson, who is 66. Now, Patterson, she at this point is living in this newly built 2-story house. It's in gum trees. It's a place that she would proudly call her forever home. It's really lovely. And she's really eager to play hostess. So when they arrive, I guess, she gives them a tour of the garden. She says, this is going to be a really special meal. I've gone to great lengths to make it a special meal. And she also, as I've noted, decided to cook beef Wellington, which, with respect, I don't do a beef Wellington because I don't eat meat. But I have done a sweet potato, chestnut and mushroom Wellington. And let me tell you, it's not an easy dish to make because getting that pastry to be nice and crispy is quite a challenge. So it's quite a tricky dish, and it will be the same if you're using steak. Now, an original meal of beef Wellington will obviously be ornate and, like I said, quite tricky. It includes steak wrapped in pate, duck cells, finely chopped mushrooms, and puff pastry. Now, in the days before she goes ahead and creates this delightful lunch, shall we say, Patterson actually went to her friends for cooking tips, asked them for advice on basically mastering this ultimate indulgence. And the recipe that she followed, it came from a really popular cookbook by an Australian author called Nagi Maeshi. And on page 252 of Dinner, Patterson basically took that recipe but made some alterations. So she knew that Dom didn't eat pork, so she didn't include the layer of prosciutto. Also, she actually chose to prepare single serving beef Wellingtons for each guest rather than one large one. Gonna throw it out there. Whilst that can seem quite incriminating because of what happens next, I do appreciate somebody deciding to make single serving beef Wellingtons because it's really tricky keeping that bloody pastry, not soggy, is challenging. And the smaller that the actual weight of that Wellington is, the more likely you're going to get that nice crispy pastry. So I do think a lot of us would choose to do single Wellingtons. I don't think that makes us thinking about murdering the guests that are coming. Now, she served with that mash and green beans. Heather brought a fruit platter for dessert and Gail brought a cake. So they sit down to eat. Apparently, one of the things that Erin Patterson notices is that Erin Patterson, has a different plate to everyone else. Now, that's no biggie. We all know that not everybody has, shall we say, ornate sets of dinner crockery to serve things on. But it's just something that he knows. And her guests basically all ate from matching Grace ornate plates. Hers was orange and slightly smaller. Now, again, not trying to say that I'm defending Erin Patterson in any way whatsoever, but what I would note in this situation is that if you are somebody who feels unhappy about your weight and you're trying to do something about your weight potentially, then you might choose to use a smaller plate, because there is that old school of dieting where they say use a smaller plate because you'll have smaller portions and that means you'll eat less. And that could be why she chooses to use a different plate. It could just be that, like me, you don't know what you're going to get. It's whatever I pull out of the cupboard, but it's probably not going to be matching, and it will definitely have a crack in some of them. That's just the way that people like me roll. There are a lot of people like me around. I'm sure a lot of you listening, you will empathise with that position. Hey, you're getting a plate. Does it have to match? No, it just has to hold food. Now, as they ate, no one found anything amiss with the food. In fact, all of the Petersons' guests complimented the meal. They said it was delicious. And you would expect that when she's put so much work into the meal. But just hours after the meal, turns out that Heather, one of the guests, was chatting with two friends from church, also going on about how delicious and beautiful the meal was. So whatever Erin Patterson had tried to pull off in that moment, delighting them with this kind of food, it had worked. But one of the things that we know happened during the meal itself was a conversation between the adults there turned quite serious. This is after Patterson's cleared the plates away. And the reason that it gets quite serious is that Erin Patterson starts talking about the health issues that she's been experiencing. She's basically saying, look, I've been going through some really serious medical issues, and there is actually a likelihood that I'm going to require some serious major surgery. So at that point, understandably, you've just had a lovely meal. You've been invited around to this person's house. You know, you might have been worried that there's going to be some conflict, but actually it's just turned into a scenario where you're sympathising and empathising with the host because they need some serious medical intervention that could resort to some serious surgery. So they just all let her know you have our full support, which is what we'd expect. They've been incredibly supportive all the way through. Now, after the meal, the group disperses, everyone goes home. Then, by Patterson's account, she did something that I suppose, if we're going to imagine there is a level of truth to her story, that could have saved her life. So she basically makes herself throw up. She vomits. Bear in mind, we do know that she struggled with her weight and she struggled with eating disorders according to her. She essentially said that she succumbed to an episode and she ate 2/3 of the cake that Gail brought. And then after eating that, she made herself throw up. Now, obviously, she would have at this point been starting to digest whatever she'd ate. But if you're throwing up relatively rapidly after eating a meal, then chances are, even if there are toxins that are involved in that meal, you're bringing it up for the most part. But obviously, the other guests don't do that. And within 12 hours of that lunch, every single one of Patterson's guests become unbelievably ill. I mean, very violently ill. So late that night and early into Sunday morning, Don, Gail and Heather and Ian, they all experienced these absolutely intense vomiting, diarrhea and dehydration symptoms. Now, bear in mind, they've had a meal, it's involved meat. They could well be putting it down to, at this moment in time, food poisoning. It's not something you'd expect when you go around to somebody's home. It's something more consistent with going to a restaurant and the food being kept in an unsanitary place. And certainly it's not in line with what you'd expect for Erin Patterson's home, particularly as she's been so proud showing her guests around. But you can imagine they're probably thinking to themselves, oh my God, it's something that I ate during that meal. But you're also going to imagine, I'm going to get better no matter how sick I feel. But by Sunday morning, this is the 30th of July 2023, they're rushed to local hospitals in Leongatha and Corranborough by the ambulance. Initially, the doctors actually, they believe, suspected a bad case of gastroenteritis, which is horrible. I'm sure many of you, if not all of you, have suffered from gastroenteritis. It's very relentless, but you're going to be okay. But as the conditions actually worsen and become very acute, the doctors realise that they're dealing with something altogether very different from those initial suspicions. Now we get to Monday the 31st of July. At this point, all 4 of the patients are suffering acute liver injury and also multi-organ failure. So this is life-threatening beyond belief. Now, the doctors at that hospital feel that they need more specialist care, so they end up transferring them to Austin Hospital in Melbourne. So that's the regional intensive care centre. Now, the medical team there, now bear in mind, these are working with acute issues in intensive care. They've pretty much seen everything. All of them said they'd never seen anything like it. It's as simple as that. So they're really concerned that they, even as specialists, are out of their depth in this moment in time. Now, Dr. Stephen Wariflow, he's the director of the ICU at Austin Health, he ended up testifying in court that the 4 patients were, quote, certainly the sickest patients in the whole state at that moment. He said they all showed the same pattern of organ failure, and that pointed to a common and powerful toxin as the cause. He then said that they would end up stabilising for a brief period, but then they'd relapse into a, quote, relentlessly progressive and frightening deterioration, leading to complete liver shutdown and damage to vital other organs. So if you imagine your whole body is shutting down, and once your liver has basically died, the likelihood is, unless they can give some very, very strong interventions, such as a liver transplant, you aren't going to make it. And the fact that other vital organs are having these symptoms, that's endemic of something seriously amiss in your body and something that would, for the most of us, be unsurvivable. Now, it turns out this is a classic feature of amatoxin poisoning. So this is when you get that false recovery phase, which then precedes the collapse. And that's obviously happened. You know, they've stabilised and then become catastrophically sick again. Now, also on July the 31st, Patterson ends up texting Simon and basically says, can you take me to hospital? I'm feeling unwell. Now, at this point, he refuses because obviously he has more pressing issues. Most of his family are direly unwell at the hospital. And again, it's telling that she gets in contact with him because that just means that she's not noted where he would be psychologically and emotionally when so many members of his family are so unwell. Now, she ends up going to Leongatha Hospital herself. This is after she's done the morning school run. She arrives there around 8 a.m. But I mean, just the fact that she's done the school run, she's got herself ready, etc., that shows that she's not in any way comparably as ill as the individuals within her wider family who are suffering greatly at hospital. Now, despite the concerns of the doctors, she does end up discharging herself. She doesn't even receive a full examination. And this really concerns the doctors. So Dr. Chris Webster calls the police, reports that Patterson had left against advice and says, look, I can't reach her on her mobile. And obviously, in light of the fact they've probably connected the dots and realised that other members of her family have been so unwell, they're probably very concerned about her well-being. Now, by Tuesday, the 1st of August, all 4 victims had to be placed on mechanical ventilators and dialysis machines just to keep them alive. So we really are looking at individuals who are at the end of their life. At this stage, medical staff basically have started to suspect it could be death cap mushroom toxin, which is amatoxin, that is indeed behind this. Now, when it comes down to death cap mushrooms, I did have to look this up. I'm not actually a fungi expert. They are apparently among the world's deadliest fungi. They contain amatoxins that are basically not destroyed by cooking, and initially they cause gastrointestinal distress, but then they attack the liver. Now, victims of death cap poisoning, they often feel fine for several hours after the initial bout of vomiting, and that's this deceptive lull, as whilst the toxin inflicts this catastrophic internal damage. So as you think you're getting better, you're in fact becoming fatally unwell. And the only definitive treatment would actually be a liver transplant, which is just enormous surgery if you can actually get a liver, because bear in mind, somebody has to die for that to happen. It has to be matched with you. Then you're going to be on anti-rejection pills for the rest of your life and so on and so forth. So this is critical where these individuals are concerned. Now, unfortunately for Patterson's victims, they aren't all candidates. Gail and Heather are too sick to qualify for transplants. So Their bodies were basically too ravaged to even survive the surgery. But Don Patterson, he is actually given the opportunity to get a new liver, but unfortunately it's not enough to save him. And the toxin had done too much damage to his body. So even though he did come across as that successful candidate, it turned out it wasn't going to be enough. Now, one by one, they succumbed. Heather Wilkinson died in the early hours of Friday, the 4th of August, 2023. She died around 2:50 a.m. Gail Patterson, she died later that same day at 5:55 p.m. And Don Patterson, he died on Saturday, the 5th of August, 2023 at 11:30 p.m. That's less than 24 hours after his wife. And Simon Patterson said later, the fact that they died on consecutive days is fitting in some ways. It reflects their togetherness. They always worked so hard to grow. I can understand those sentiments. The idea that, yeah, they've died in the most horrific way at the hands of somebody they should have been allowed to trust. But at the end of the day, they died together and they'd spent their lives together and grown together. And knowing that they are together now is comforting, particularly in light of the fact that, bear in mind, they are Baptists. They have a very strong conviction and belief system. So as far as the family are concerned, they are definitely together in heaven. Now, bear in mind, there is a sole survivor here, Ian Wilkinson, who must have gone through the most horrific trauma, as well as losing a partner. It's just knowing that you nearly died. Now, he was in critical condition throughout August. He actually spent around 7 weeks in hospital, and that was including time in a coma. But wow, he pulls through. He had a lot of intensive treatment, but he made it. On the 22nd of September 2023, he ends up getting discharged from hospital and he was allowed to thankfully go home. Although it won't be a home he recognises the same, because his world's become vulnerable and unsafe and he's lost his life partner, which is a horrendous cross to bear. Now, Erin Patterson, as I said, she did go to hospital, but guess what? She never felt gravely ill. She never sought true medical attention. She said she had minor stomach upsets that involved going to the toilets every 20 minutes, but apparently this resolved quickly. And to the police, the doctors, to literally everybody else, this was a massive red flag. Bear in mind, she cooked a meal for 4 pensioners. All of them fell ill and only one survived, whereas she didn't really have any symptoms. So either she's the luckiest person at the table or maybe the most malevolent. Now, as soon as it became clear that all the 4 victims had been poisoned by death cap mushrooms, homicide detectives in Victoria launched an investigation and they begin treating Patterson as their suspect immediately. But they also have to be aware that they've got to gather the evidence necessary to bring a case against her. So Monday the 31st of July, this is when the investigation's kicking off. It's while the victims are all lying in critical care. And bear in mind, at this point, the doctors are racing to confirm the cause. There was a strong suspicion at this point that it couldn't be commercially sold mushrooms because death caps aren't sold in supermarkets. No one's selling deathly poisons in supermarkets to just people coming in looking for their fungi of choice. You know, it's not going to be the case, is it? So at this point, they think, well, okay, what's the common denominator here? Well, it's that Patterson cooked lunch for them. She's made beef Wellington. Therefore, we need to go and investigate exactly what was in, ingredients-wise, those Wellingtons. He said he treated the victims early on and he'd found some of the statements that she'd made quite fishy. Now, when she eventually spoke to him, bear in mind, she claimed the mushrooms that she'd used in the beef Wellington were store-bought from Woolworths. Now, Dr. Webster said he knew that was virtually impossible. He said if it was death caps as he suspected, there is absolutely no way they would have been bought from any store like Woolworths. So immediately that raises his suspicions. And he also said there was just something about her demeanour, the way she was at the hospital. So she did come and visit briefly. She wanted to check on the victims, or maybe she wanted to feign concern, shall we say. Oh, I'm really concerned. Are they dead yet? You know, that could have well been a motivation. And the witnesses who saw her visit said she just sat meters away from the ICU beds of Ian and Heather. She didn't show any concern at all. And Dr. Webster said he found that quite stark and described, as he put it, the behaviour as evil and sociopathic in his eyes, and said in his gut he felt that she deliberately poisoned them, said that she had a dilemma and the solution that she chose was sociopathic. So that's his mindset on reflection of her actions, obviously in light of all the evidence as well. So that's formed his opinion. Now we get to Saturday the 5th of August. This is the day that Don died. Police at this point search Patterson's house because they've got a warrant to do so, and they seize several items for testing. This included a mobile phone. By the way, it's referred to as phone B. Apparently she had another phone which she carried on using at that point and after that point. And then Patterson was brought to the police station for an interview that same weekend. She's questioned for hours by homicide investigators about what happened at the lunch. She's then released pending further inquiries. Now, the police had also been asked to retrieve any physical evidence of the meal. Of course, that's important because if you're going to process toxicology on the meal, you need remnants of it. So one officer, basically double gloved for safety, lifted the lid on the red wheelie bin outside Patterson's home and recovered what remained of that lunch. They found mushroom scraps, they found other food remnants that Patterson had thrown away. So at this point, they send samples for forensic testing, and they do later confirm that they contain traces of Amanita phalloides, which is death cap mushrooms. The detectives also at this point learn of Patterson's 2 children and learn that they had been at the house on the 29th of July, but they hadn't eaten the beef Wellington. So according to Inspector Thomas, the kids, quote, ate a different meal than the rest of the group. In fact, Patterson actually sent them to the cinema that afternoon, so basically removed them from the aftermath of the scene entirely. And I suppose the inspector was talking to people about this, inferring that she was basically protecting her children from the poisonous dish that she had made. Bear in mind, that's not how Patterson is going to play this. She's not going to admit that she did anything wrong. She sticks to her story, says, look, this is a terrible mistake. That's all it is. I didn't intentionally harm my family. I'd foraged for wild mushrooms in the past as a hobby. I picked fungi from around my own property. I picked it from public parks during the autumn season. I even bought a food dehydrator in April 2023 to preserve them because, as she put it, I love wild mushrooms, but also she recognised that they did spoil quickly when they were fresh. Now, a few days before the lunch, Patterson says, look, I purchased a packet of dried Chinese mushrooms from an Asian grocery store in Melbourne's eastern suburbs, and I wanted to use those in the beef Wellington. Now, she said those store-bought dried shiitake or porcini mushrooms were apparently really, really pungent in aroma. She thought to herself, I don't know whether I want to put this in the dish. Maybe it'll be overpowering for them. So she said she removed them from the original packet, stored them in a Tupperware container in her pantry. Now, sometime earlier, she did admit that she had also dried some of her foraged mushrooms and placed them in the same container as the Chinese mushrooms. In other words, she's trying to say, look, there's a possibility that cross-contamination in the pantry has led to this tragedy, a mix-up of these innocent mushrooms with unknowing lethal wild ones. Now, crucially, Patterson claimed that she didn't realise any of this until days after the lunch. So she says that it's on the 1st of August that she has this conversation with Simon at Monash Hospital, and he apparently confronts her and says whether a food dehydrator was, quote, how you poisoned my parents. Now, this accusation apparently triggers this sudden realisation that the dehydrated mushrooms might have been the culprit. She said it caused me to do a lot of thinking. What if they'd gone in the container with the Chinese mushrooms? Maybe that had happened. I don't know about that though. Come on, guys, let's be real. If you had got a Tupperware full of mushrooms that you've gone out and actually dehydrated yourself, and then you've got these other mushrooms you bought, you're going to know that you're putting those mushrooms in with the other mushrooms because it's a Tupperware, it's see-through, and you're putting them in. But essentially, this is what she's suggesting maybe happened. Well, like I said, it worries me that because you would know if you placed them with other mushrooms. But she said at this point she felt really scared. She thought her children might be taken away if people believed that she'd actually gone ahead and done this on purpose. Now, Simon says, do you know what? That's a massive figment of her imagination because we never had that conversation. But it seems that according to Patterson, this made her panic. This is apparently imaginary conversation between her and Patterson. So she takes several steps over the next few days that don't exactly exonerate her from looking guilty. They do quite the opposite. They make her look totally guilty. So on the 2nd of August, Patterson dumps the food dehydrator at the local tip. Investigators later find a dehydrator discarded on a landfill. And guess what? Forensic tests detect traces of death cap mushroom in it. Now, initially, she tells the police she never even owned a dehydrator at all. And then she lies again. In fact, she lies repeatedly to police in her 5th August interview. She denies ever foraging for mushrooms. She denies ever having a dehydrator. Claims, obviously on reflection, that these were lies to hide the embarrassing mushroom hobby and the accidental mix-up. Well, number one, you want to forage for your mushrooms, sweetheart? You bob off and do that. No one's going to find that embarrassing. Most of us would think, well, that's the way to save a bit of cash, and it must be nice being able to do that. But the embarrassment, I suppose, she's referring to in that moment is also to do with the accidental mix-up. It's more than embarrassing, though, isn't it? It led to the deaths of people. That wouldn't be embarrassing and an accident. That would be something utterly tragic beyond belief. But this is the language that she uses, so it's a minimizing language. Now, bear in mind, investigators have to go and check out the shops that she suggested she bought the mushrooms from, and they couldn't find any mushrooms being sold in local shops that matched the ones Patterson said that she bought. So that doesn't make sense either. Also, another thing that makes her look, I don't know, a little bit on the guilty side is the fact that she performs multiple factory resets on her phone. She even wipes data remotely after handing it over to the police. How do people know how to do this? Is it just me? I would not have it. You can take my phone now and there's 10 years of text messages on it. It's as simple as, since I got the phone, nothing has been reset and I would not know how to do that, certainly not remotely. But she knows how to do this. She's a bright person after all. She's obviously figured that out. Now, it's clear that the reason you would be doing that is if you were deleting incriminating evidence. And that could be for things like Google searches for mushrooms, etc. Because we know that they digitally analyse your footprint and what you've been up to. And she obviously doesn't want them to. Now, we get to the 2nd of November 2023. This is when Victoria Police actually feel that they have enough evidence and they're confident enough to actually arrest her. So at this point, she's formally charged with 3 counts of murder and 1 count of attempted murder. She's also not given bail because obviously we're talking about a series of deaths and we're talking about her being a very dangerous person to be on the streets if she is indeed guilty of these charges. Now, of course, whilst all this is playing out, the wider family are having to come to terms with the members that they've lost. And the funerals occurred on the 31st of August 2023. This is when a public memorial service was held in Corranborough Indoor Recreation Centre to celebrate the lives of Don and Gail Patterson. Reverend Fran Grimes actually opened the service by just acknowledging the intense media attention the case had garnered. It's not very private at all, it's so public. They said, the overwhelming media scrutiny has meant private grieving and tears have been incredibly difficult, but also praised how incredibly the community had come together to protect the families of the victims. Simon Patterson himself delivered a really emotional eulogy for his parents, described them as a team who were just inseparable. Married for nearly 50 years, they'd raised 4 children. And actually, he mentioned that Gail's final message to the family group chat was sent while she was in hospital, and it wrote, "Lots of love to you all." So thinking about her children, even when she was so gravely ill. He also talked about their really deep Christian faith and his parents' belief that death is indeed not final. Now, after Ian Wilkinson was released, because obviously he had that period of time where he was in a coma and gravely ill, he did hold a memorial service for Heather. That was in the same recreation centre on the 4th of October 2023. Actually, over 300 people came. Bear in mind, Ian was still recovering and he didn't choose to speak at that moment in time. It was probably just the most overwhelming and traumatic thing to go through on top of what he'd already been through. So their son, David Wilkinson, delivered the eulogy for his mother, said, "She loved being a mum and she loved us. She was uncompromising but full of grace." He also noted how religious Heather was, even mentioning that Don and Gail Patterson were key to mum's coming to faith. So they essentially saying that she was brought into the fold by Don and Gail. And he also said that she never looked back once she found her faith. So just a very reinforcing statement. Noticeably, Erin Patterson didn't attend any of those services, but I have to say, you wouldn't, would you? Because you are in the line of fire. People are really suspicious of you, and it would just be disrespectful to attend. And she wouldn't wish to, because she knows what people are thinking. Now, the trial that began on the 29th of April 2025 at the Latrobe Valley Law Courts in Morwell, Victoria. The judge presiding over the case was Justice Christopher Beale. The prosecution was run by Nanette Rogers and the defence by Colin Mandy. The trial lasted 9 weeks. It's a big old trial. There was a lot of evidence to be brought in. The jury consisted of 10 men and 5 women. There were also 3 designated as reserves. Now, the conviction, that would require a unanimous verdict among the chosen 12. Now, the trial was actually moved to Morwell, which is around 2.5 hours from Melbourne. And for the trial days, Patterson was remanded in the cells of Morwell Police Station. At this point, her lawyer actually raised concerns with the Justice Beale about Patterson being denied a duvet, pillow, and also access to her laptop. This is when she's being held in the police cells. And apparently it was said that she needed her laptop to go through the, quote, massive police brief. Now, she was ultimately provided bedding and allowed to keep her legal notes and paperwork while in the cells. And with respect, that should be the case, because as much as people might think it's arrogant to ask for your pillows and your bedding and your laptop, you're meant to be innocent until proven guilty. So essentially that could be an innocent person who's being denied her legal rights. And also, comfort's important. You need to sleep well if you've got a big case coming up. So I understand those requests, although when you see it in black and white, it comes across that she's being a little bit, shall we say, entitled. But like I say, when you bring it down to the bare bones, it's for the right reasons. Now, Justice Beale, they informed the jury that the prosecution had decided not to pursue charges that Patterson had attempted to kill Simon in the months prior to the lunch, and said, you must put them out of your mind. So essentially, they hadn't felt there was enough to charge her for Simon's serious illness, and they didn't want the jury to feel contaminated by that and believe that it was linked. Now, the first witness on the 1st of May 2025 was Simon Patterson. Now, he'd been informed by the judge that he actually didn't have to give evidence against his estranged wife, but he said that he had not been aware that he didn't have to testify due to his marriage to Patterson, but he also said he was willing to continue. And a reporter actually said that everyone in the media overflow room breathed a sigh of relief that he was still happy to testify, because that could have meant that the trial had to begin again. So he testified that Patterson had a really close relationship with his dad, Don, that they shared this love of science. Also, he detailed his very tumultuous relationship with Patterson, the arguments over property, the arguments over finances. And he also confirmed that, yes, she was very disappointed that he declined to go for lunch that day. Simon had taken also his parents and the Wilkinsons to the hospital when they fell sick, so he'd been through the trauma of that, and said that Heather Wilkinson twice recalled that Patterson had actually eaten from a different coloured plate from the other guests. So that was obviously something that had stayed with the guests. Also, he said that Erin Patterson was upset that he'd listed himself as single in his 2022 tax returns, and said that that was because it affected their tax arrangements, and that she'd sent extremely aggressive messages over child support payments in the months leading up to the alleged murders, and the court were indeed shown those text messages. He also testified that Patterson had never asked about the well-being of her in-laws following the mushroom poisoning incident, and said that she was also really reluctant to go to the Dandenong Hospital for a checkup on the 31st of July 2023, which is 2 days after the incident. Patterson and her 2 children had subsequently gone to the Monash Medical Centre at Clayton, and Simon also told the court that the reason that Patterson had arranged for the lunch was in order to discuss her purported cancer diagnosis to her relatives. Now, on cross-examination, Simon did testify that Patterson owned several mismatched plate sets, and that there was one colourful plastic plate that had been made by her daughter, and he believed that that was likely the plate that she used during lunch. He also said that he'd remained part of Patterson's extended family and also attended family events, despite the fact they'd been separated in 2015. Also said that she did have a history of leaving hospitals against medical advice, and also experienced various medical issues throughout their marriage. This included heart arrhythmia, chronic disease, and also postnatal depression. So I guess cross-examination is going, well, this is actually typical of her behaviour. It's not atypical. She leaves when she's being advised to stay in hospitals. Also, he denied during cross-examination that he had said about her using the dehydrator to prepare the meal before dumping it at a local tip. So this conversation was allegedly something that took place on the 31st of July, but like I said, Simon Patterson said it didn't happen. Now, in court, they heard from 3 separate women, Christine Hunt, Daniela Barkley, and Jenny Hay. Now, these all knew Erin Patterson via Facebook groups. So the courts were shown posts made by Patterson, which basically showed the Dehydrator, along with sliced mushrooms, that were actually sent in a Facebook group containing the 4 women. So Jenny noted Patterson was really interested in mushrooms. Daniela testified that the 4 women bonded through the mutual interest in the Kelly Lane murder case as well. And they said that Patterson asked the group for advice on cooking beef Wellington a fortnight before the lunch. They also noted that Patterson was apparently an atheist who clashed with her Baptist husband Simon, who she alleged was abusive and coercive. It's interesting to imagine that she would wear this mask of being somebody who attended the church and was a volunteer for the newsletter and so on and so forth, but she's in private groups saying that she's actually an atheist and alleging abuse. Now, Ian Wilkinson, bear in mind the only survivor of the poisoning, he's also asked in court to recall the visit. And he said that during the visit, Patterson was really reluctant to actually let Heather and Gail inspect the pantry. So bear in mind, she was a host who was showing these people around her home, but she doesn't want them to go into the pantry. Also, she declined their help to plate the beef Wellingtons. So that, in his mind, was suspicious. Why doesn't she want help? But there again, lots of us make food people. They come into the kitchen, you're like, just get out of the kitchen. Just let me get on with things. Because it can be too many cooks spoil the broth scenario in those situations. But he corroborates Simon's testimony that Patterson basically eats from a different plate, it's a different colour from the rest. And he also said that she clearly told her guests that a diagnostic test had found, quote, a life-threatening cancer, and she was basically asking them for support, which they were willingly giving her over that lunch. Now, Don and Gail's daughter, a woman called Anna Terrington, she ends up giving testimony about her parents' relationship with Erin Patterson and said it was relatively unusual for the Wilkinsons to have been invited round for lunch. It wasn't something that happened on a regular basis. Now, on cross-examination, however, the defence then asked her about a $400,000 loan that Patterson and Simon had given her to purchase their family home. Because again, that's indicative of Patterson caring about the family, isn't it? That she's handing out massive amounts of money interest-free. So I think it's important to bring that in because let's just say when it comes down to that particular individual, they might think it would be handy if Patterson goes to prison, maybe they wouldn't have to pay the loan back. I'm just playing with the analysis here. I'm not saying that's the case. I'm just saying that on cross-examination, that's what the defence wants to do, isn't it? They want to destabilise the integrity of that particular witness. Now, they also bring in Mark Douglas. He's the emergency doctor from Monash Health, and he testifies about the mushroom poisoning symptoms. We know those that were experienced by the Pattersons and the Wilkinsons. So he brings in testimony. Also, they bring in nurses, Kylie Ashton. She's from Gippsland's Southern Health Service. She's a nursing director. She actually spoke to the court and said that Patterson refused to let the hospital staff examine her and also signed a discharge at her own risk form. So the defence at this point suggests that Patterson was prepared to have treatment, by the way, but just not at that point. So they're saying, okay, she wanted to leave, but it didn't mean she didn't want treatment. She just didn't want it at that point. Now, Cindy Munro, Leongatha Director of Nursing, also testified that Patterson refused to accept medical treatment and testing. So this is something within her nature at this moment in time. She doesn't want anybody investigating. Also, Conor McDermott, who was Austin Hospital Toxicology Registrar, they recalled that Patterson claimed she was experiencing diarrhea, but when he tested her bloods, they were normal. Also, they said that she gave a lot of conflicting information about where she brought the mushrooms before settling on a supermarket and Asian grocery store. So she wasn't confirmed. She kind of went around the houses and then was like, oh, it's here and here. And that worried them because they were insisting that she should have known where she got these things from. Now, the jury were actually shown a pre-recorded police interview of Patterson's daughter. And that daughter said, listen, Mum did experience diarrhea following the lunch. Also, they said, we ate the leftovers. In fact, she said she and her brother ate the leftovers from the lunch for dinner on the 30th of July and said that she was actually unaware of Patterson using mushrooms in her cooking. Now, the court were also shown a police interview of Patterson's teenage son, and he again confirmed the details about the lunch and the guests on the 29th of July. And he described Patterson's relationship with Simon, as in the boy's father, as very negative. Simon apparently asked to be included in the children's school billing records so he could access their school records and activities, and he'd done this without consulting Patterson. He also said that he and his sister were closer to their mum than their dad because he, quote, does a lot of things to try and hurt mum. Also told the police that Patterson had driven him to Tayab for a flying lesson on the 30th of July and said, yeah, okay, fair enough. During that trip, she didn't use the toilet, even though she was saying she had chronic diarrhea that morning. But he did corroborate his sister's account that they finished the leftover lunch for dinner. Now, Thomas May, who is a mycologist, he actually came in and gave expert testimony about the death cap mushrooms in Victoria. He confirmed that 4 images uploaded to the iNaturalist website were consistent with death cap mushrooms, and he conceded on cross that there was a risk of the public misidentifying mushrooms. So he agrees that in spite of the fact that these look very incriminating, it could be that you could misidentify the mushrooms and believe you were eating something safe. And people do every single year. People go foraging and they die of horrendous toxins because they ate the wrong thing. We see the same where fish are concerned, where they catch a particular fish, they eat it, they don't realise how toxic the fish is, and they end up dead. This is not something that is incongruent with reality. People do these things. Now, Camille Truong, she was a mycologist at the Royal Botanic Gardens in Victoria. She actually said, listen, it's improbable that Erin Patterson purchased the death cap mushrooms from an Asian grocer or a supermarket. They only grow out in the wild. They can't be cultivated commercially. And bear in mind, she actually submitted a leftover sample from the beef Wellington lunch as evidence. But she said that when she tested it, there was no trace of death cap mushrooms in the leftover sample. So she isn't agreeing that there was absolute evidence of this toxin. She's actually going against that and saying she couldn't find any. But she's equally saying it would be almost impossible to buy these commercially, if not impossible. So she's not denying culpability in that moment. Now, Katrina Cripps, who was a child protection practitioner, she actually told the court that Patterson's children disliked visiting their father. They accused their father of yelling at them and also sleeping during the weekend, which you shouldn't be doing if you're a parent who's responsible and accountable. You should be up with your kids. Also, they said that Patterson's relationship with their father and in-laws had deteriorated in the period leading up to the lunch, which you'd expect because she was feeling alienated from the family. And obviously, people pick their allegiances, and it tends to be with your blood relatives. Now, Patterson was actually unable to recall where she bought the mushrooms. She was very evasive when she was asked about whether she'd foraged the mushrooms herself. So again, that's relatively incriminating. Now, the head of forensic science and chief toxicologist of the Victorian Institute of Forensic Medicine, a guy called Dr. Dimitri Gerastamoulos, he was actually brought into court, and he said that the Victorian Institute tested the meat, pastry and mushroom pate samples from the beef Wellington that were recovered from Patterson's bin after the lunch, and one of the 4 mushroom samples contained beta-amanitin, which is an amatoxin found in death cap mushrooms. So he then briefed the jury on the toxicology results from Don, Gail and Heather, which tested negative for alpha-amanitin and beta-amanitin. Now, Ian Wilkinson, he did test positive for alpha-amanitin and beta-amanitin. And Patterson's 2 children, they tested negative. Now, the jury at this point were actually shown photos of exhibits taken during the toxicological analysis. And guess what? It's at this point, a really important point during the actual trial, that a jury member gets dismissed. And the reason that jury member gets dismissed is they end up sharing information about the case with family and friends. There's always one, isn't there? There's always one who just can't keep things to themselves. You can imagine, can't you, when you're being told, listen, as a jury, you all have to keep things stum, confidential. The reason is, if you are to speak to anybody outside of this court about this case, you could literally jeopardize it. And that's hundreds of thousands of pounds just wasted. So you have to be very good at keeping secrets. Are you all okay with that? Yes, we're all okay with that. Right, well, we're going to allow you in. Just sit down, keep everything quiet, and you'll be fine. Okay, we'll do that. Later that same day, Mum, you're not going to believe this. I've seen the most unbelievable pictures. And that's how things end up on Facebook and social media and cases crumble. But in this case, obviously, they have got the reserved individuals who can come and step in. But like I said, it compromises the case in a way that should not occur. Now, Dr. David Lovelock, he was brought into court. He's a manager of diagnostics at Plant Health Australia. And the Victoria Department of Health asked Lovelock, who's a massive expert, to test for mushrooms in 2 samples of the beef Wellington from Patterson's lunch. He confirmed that butter mushroom DNA was found in the beef Wellington leftovers, while samples from the food Dehydrator had a 99% similarity to death cap mushrooms. So obviously another link there. They also brought in digital forensic science expert Matthew Sorrell. He analysed the call records of one of Patterson's mobile phones between the 1st of January 2019 and the 3rd of August 2023. She had used the phone to access photos of death cap mushrooms on iNaturalist in April and May 2023. And Sorrell confirmed his analysis of her phone showed Patterson had visited Locke twice in autumn 2023. So she'd literally been in the area where you can pick those mushrooms. The court was also told that the police had been unable to recover Patterson's mobile phone, which the prosecution says was used during those visits. So conveniently, they never found the other phone. Remember there was phone B? Well, phone A never turned up. Brian Beer, who is a pathologist at Victoria Institute of Forensic Medicine, he supervised Heather Wilkinson's autopsy. He also testified that she did indeed have necrosis of the liver and a bowel lining was also necrotic. He also said that Don Patterson received a liver transplant but noted it failed and confirmed that Don Patterson died from liver failure and multiple organ failure. And Amanita phalloides toxin was also detected in his body. Now, Senior Constable Stephen Eppingstall, he was a leading detective on this case. He said that his team analysed Patterson's bank records. They were able to identify a transaction of interest from the Coonwarra transfer station on the 2nd of August 2023. Then, following the deaths of Heather Wilkinson and Gail Patterson, this on the 4th of August, Eppingstall questioned Patterson about her beef Wellington recipe. He also said that when they were doing the search with the warrant, he didn't see 4 grey-coloured plates in the video when they searched Patterson's home. Also, they concluded during that search that her Samsung phone had been factory reset 4 times. The court was also shown Patterson's police interview. This is where she literally denies owning a food dehydrator. And also they were shown maps of Locke and Outram area and CCTV movements of Patterson's car on the 8th of August 2023. Now, Patterson's daughter initially said she couldn't recall her mum visiting a local Asian grocer. Later, she changes her testimony, she remembers it. The jury was shown Patterson's Woolworths transaction history. They were shown her medical records, information about Woolworths mushroom supplies, cultivation practices. They were also shown Patterson's diary, her text and Facebook messages, her phone call history, screenshots of her computer history, and they testified that Patterson acknowledged owning Samsung and Nokia phones. So basically, all this evidence makes it seem that she's being duplicitous and deceptive. Now, Mandy cross-examines Eppingstall about the devices that the police didn't seize from the Patterson home, but Eppingstall rejects the defence's suggestion that a photo showed a Samsung phone labelled phone A, and that police said, listen, we never located that, and he stands by that. Eppingstall said, look, if we had got that device, it would have been seized by the police and it would have been analysed by the police. Now, when it came down to the defence, Erin Patterson actually took the stand in her own defence. She was the only defence witness. She testified about her relationship with Simon and her in-laws. She attributed her and Simon's separations between 2009 and 2015 to communication issues, but said, listen, by 2023, our relationship had improved. She said, look, I acknowledge I do have self-esteem issues. My weight gain really bothered me. And if I'm really being honest, I'd planned to undergo gastric bypass surgery around July 2023. So basically, that's the operation that she was talking about. It's not cancer. She wants a bypass surgery to lose weight. She also said, listen, I did forage for mushrooms in Leongatha and Corumbara for several years leading up to 2023. I accept that there were death cap mushrooms inside the beef Wellingtons that I cooked on the 31st of July, but on reflection, I don't know how they were there. She said, as far as I'm concerned, I bought most of the ingredients from a Leongatha supermarket and also some forest mushrooms mixed from a Melbourne-based grocer. I did use a food dehydrator to preserve the mushrooms for use later in the year. And I did intend to use several mushrooms that I bought from the Asian grocer, but stored them because of the smell. She also said, listen, I believe the forage mushrooms ended up in the lunch due to a mistake about the contents of the containers in my pantry. So she basically puts it all down to this horrible accidental mess. But then she asked to actually answer questions about why she told the family that she had cancer. And she says, okay, I lied. I was just too embarrassed to tell my relatives that I was going to get gastric bypass surgery to deal with my weight. But you know what? I find that really strange. The idea of lying to your family about something so enormous as having cancer, that just seems so wrong to me. The idea that you would emotionally impact them this way, knowing the truth that actually apparently you just wanted to have bypass surgery, and no one's concerned about that. Everybody will help you out, particularly if you've got weight issues. The family will be supportive of those issues without a shadow of a doubt. The idea that she's using this as I just need you to understand I've got low self-esteem, that's why I did it, it doesn't really make sense as far as I'm concerned. Now, she also said that the reason she organised the lunch for the family was to bolster relationships with the Patterson family. She was afraid that they were becoming separate, distant, because of the fact that she and Simon weren't necessarily on the best of terms. She also told the court that she vomited after the lunch because she'd ate most of the cake that Gail had brought her, and that she then experienced diarrhea for several days. She said that she took drugs to treat the symptoms, and she then told the jury that she also did become very anxious after Simon confronted her in the hospital about whether she used her food dehydrator to poison his parents. So that was her excuse. It was all a terrible mistake. Yes, I didn't have cancer, but understand I've got low self-esteem. I wanted to have an operation to lose weight. And Simon made me feel really nervous because he accused me of poisoning his parents. And that's why I dumped the dehydrator at the tip, making me look super guilty. Now, on cross-examination, she denied deliberately cultivating the death cap mushrooms. She denied putting them in the beef Wellingtons. She denied weighing them to calculate a fatal dose per person. She also disputed the prosecution's account that she told her relatives at the lunch that she had cancer. And when she was questioned about the food dehydrator, Patterson ended up admitting that she had previously lied about not owning it, telling the court, quote, I had disposed of it a few days earlier in the context of thinking that maybe the mushrooms that I'd foraged or the meal I prepared were responsible for making people sick. It was this stupid knee-jerk reaction to just dig deeper and keep lying. I was just scared, but I shouldn't have done it. No, you really shouldn't, because when it comes down to the jury, that ain't going to look good for you, kid. Now, of course, she also denied accessing posts about death cap mushrooms on iNaturalist in May 2022, even though the court were able to show extracted data from Patterson's own computer, showing that Bing had indeed been used to search for iNaturalist in May 2022. She told the court that she'd recently foraged mushrooms and may have placed them in the same plastic container with the store-bought mushrooms used in the beef Wellingtons. She also expressed regret for an apparent angry Facebook message attacking her in-laws in December 2022, but she again disputed the prosecution's argument that this reflected her true feelings about them. The prosecution, led by Nanette Rogers, said that Patterson had been very keen to dispose of any evidence that might connect her with the possession of death cap mushrooms. And in reference to the photo of death cap mushrooms on scales in Patterson's own home, Rogers said, I suggest that you were weighing these death cap mushrooms so you could calculate the weight required for the administration of a fatal dose for one person and the weight required for 5 fatal doses. Apparently, there had been reports of death cap mushrooms in Lock 3 months prior to the murders, and Rogers said, I am going to suggest that because of that, you went to Lock that day to find death cap mushrooms. Now, of course, Patterson denies all of this. It's as simple as that. She denies as well that she ever used that different coloured plate from her guests. She also denied making a 6th beef Wellington for Simon in case he attended, which doesn't make any sense because she was hoping he would attend, so you would imagine that she would make the 6th. And she did in fact make 6 individual beef Wellingtons instead of one large one. But the excuse for that is she couldn't source a piece of beef large enough for a single beef Wellington. She also disputed evidence given by several medical staff. This included Cindy Munro, who testified that Patterson was apparently reluctant to allow her children to be tested for poisoning. And that particular individual recalled that Patterson became anxious after medical staff informed her about the possibility of death cap mushroom poisoning during the lunch, which you would if you were hoping to get away with murder and they say, we might think that there's some kind of very fatal mushroom being used here. You'd be like, oh, that makes me look guilty, particularly if you are guilty. She also denied misleading the Department of Health authorities when she initially claimed she brought the death cap mushrooms from an Asian grocer. And she also had to acknowledge to the court that when she was talking about getting that gastric bypass, she told the investigators that she'd spoken to the Enrich Clinic where she booked a pre-surgery appointment for one, but apparently they never offered that procedure. So that didn't look very good for her on a telling the truth level. Now, when it came down to the closing arguments, the prosecution said that Patterson employed 4 deceptions over the course of several months before the lunch. So first of all, she fabricated her cancer claim. Then she deliberately incorporated death cap mushrooms into the meal. Then she pretended to have diarrhea after the lunch. And then she engaged in a sustained cover-up to conceal the role in poisoning her guests, which includes lying about the origins of the mushrooms served in the meal and then attempting to dispose of the food dehydrator at a landfill. Now, the defence, ran by Mandy, said that the defence case rested on 2 premises: that Patterson had accidentally added the death cap mushrooms to the meal, and that there was a reasonable possibility that she'd not intended to kill or injure her guests. And they also asked the jury to reject Ian Wilkinson's testimony that Patterson served guests on 4 large grey plates whilst eating from a different plate herself, said that the Crown's reliance on social media posts from December 2022 did not accurately represent Patterson's relationship with them, and also that her online searches for death cap mushrooms reflected idle curiosity rather than malevolence. Although, with respect, Patterson did try to deny that she'd even done that. So, quite idle to the point where she has no memory of it with respect. Now, after an exhausting 9-week trial, this included 8 days consecutively of testimony from Patterson, the jurors were left to deliberate. And bear in mind, Patterson was resolute throughout this that she was innocent. She was also planning things when she was going to get out and go home. She had no belief whatsoever that she would ever be found guilty of this crime. The jury deliberated for 6 days. That's a ton of time. That means that some of them were not convinced of her guilt, but nonetheless, on the 7th of July 2025, they did return a unanimous verdict of guilty on all counts. Now, Patterson herself, she apparently showed no emotion as the verdict was read out. And after the verdict, one of Patterson's close friends, Ali Rose Pryor, told the media, "I am saddened, but it is what it is." Now, sentencing is actually still to come, as well as a possible appeal. There will be an appeal without a shadow of a doubt. The maximum sentence will be life in prison, but legal experts are actually assuming there'll be a non-parole period of between 30 and 37 years. Patterson is currently 50, so that would mean that her prison sentence could see her incarcerated into her 80s. One of the things about Australian courts is they try to avoid what they consider are, quote, crushing sentences that destroy, quote, any reasonable expectation of useful life after release. But if she does get 50 years, well, she'll be in her 80s, so there won't be a lot potentially as far as she will consider useful life after release at that point. I'm not trying to say people at 87 don't have a useful life, they do. I'm just saying that if you're trying to rebuild your life at 87 when you are free, well, you might think to yourself, chances are you might never get there, and even if you do, you might be infirm or incapable of building any sort of life that's free. So it could be a full life term in some way or another, no matter whether she's incarcerated for that entire period or whether she does get to be free at the age of 86, 87, and so on and so forth. I suppose what really interests me is the 6 days of deliberation, because I don't think it was clear cut. I don't. As much as obviously the case that I brought to you today, based on what's been said in court, suggests that she is indeed guilty, it tells me that whatever the jury concluded, it was not an easy conclusion. What was it that they saw or heard that made them question whether she was indeed innocent or guilty? And what will that look like at appeal? What will happen down the line? Is it indeed a clear-cut case of a cold, calculating killer who poisoned the wider family and actually intended to also poison her estranged husband? Or is it that it could have been some kind of dreadful mistake? I don't know. I mean, I'm going to go with the fact that she's apparently a cold, calculated killer, because that's what the courts have found. But like I said, when it takes 6 days of deliberation, it makes me think, what did those jury members hear that made them feel that potentially she wasn't 100% guilty? I'd love to know that information. I'd love to know your thoughts on it as well. Whatever your thoughts, let me know in the comments. This has been a long one because it is a long one. I can't avoid it. If I want to bring the case to you fully, I have to give it to you fully. I can't skip anything, and this was a big one. I hope you found it interesting. I'd love to know whether you believe she's guilty or innocent, or you're on the fence. As ever, I love reading your comments, and I will see you again next time. My lovelies, take care, look after yourselves, as ever. Be safe. And make sure that when you go foraging, you understand which kind of mushrooms can kill you and which can't. Just a little life tip for you. See you again next time. Hi guys, I'm just jumping on very quickly. This is not normal because obviously my video is finished, but I got some extra information saying that Erin Patterson has basically been diagnosed with Munchausen's apparently during her incarceration, which is really interesting to me because clearly she's suggesting that the reason that she said that she had cancer was because she suffers from Munchausen's. For those of you who don't know what Munchausen's is, it's basically factitious disorder. It means that you make stuff up so that people give you lots of attention. And she's claiming that that's the case. But it makes me think, could it be Munchausen's by proxy, therefore? I.e., she likes harming other people so that attention is placed upon her as well. Certainly, if you think about the individual that she used to work with when she was an air traffic controller, they accused her of putting razor blades in bananas. So I'm just throwing it out there. It could be that she has been diagnosed with Munchausen's, or indeed Munchausen's by proxy, but it's also worth noting that a lot of people in my field don't really think it exists. What actually exists is just people who are a little bit on the evil side. Anyway, just wanted to update you quickly.